Okay, I would like to welcome you all to this today's last session. We have one change in the schedule, so Aura Elena Schussler won't be with us today. So we have three persons in this session. We have Alberto Simonetti, Nevena Mitranic, and Stefan Jankovic with us. So without further ado, I would like to ask Alberto Simonetti to open this last session.
Thanks for this occasion and this organization. My paper starts from a question. The title is Education for Posteriority. Posteriority in the West conceptual method. And the question is how to educate in posthumanism. Is it possible today to talk about education? Do we have living beings capable of critical thinking? The contemporary world is marked by an emergency, the school system and the future of knowledge. The time for education is now only concerning the present. The knowledge, but also the general education, need the past to build the future, their future. In contemporary horizon, the administrative drift of educational institutions, from kindergarten to universities, all levels, has led to a decline of the dialogue between knowledge and science, human science and science strong. If the humanistic time was shaped by absolute paradigms, rationality, dialectics, sense of whole, or totality, in the lesson of Hegel, of Hegelian philosophy, as the current technocratic time is marked by hyperspeed. Paul Virilio wrote Aesthetic of Disappearance about hypervelocization and hyperspeed. It is necessary to overcome both patterns. We need to clarify this. Rejecting humanism does not mean avoiding the past. The classic of each era, Machiavelli, Aristotle, Plato, rejecting the technocratic power of educational mediation does not mean not look to the future of technology with real utility. In a global sharing society, in my opinion, the biggest risk is not sharing knowledge, problems, and research. The indication of the global market, the system of globalization, my opinion, impose a type of culture aimed at the exchange value in the sense of capital, das Kapital of Karl Marx. It's not exchange of utility. On the contrary, the use of culture is the crossing of the other as a word to be known without reductions. The effort of an interdisciplinary study is long, but the new generations need one circular interdynamic perspective. The alienation and the request for attestation of existence induced by the various social networks, aggravated by the COVID pandemic, shows us important mission, decisive mission. In every sector, the master must leave his mark. In Latin, insignum. In Italian, insegnante. Insignum. Leave the track in the surface of knowledge, of history of knowledge of everybody. He must refuse the colonizing mandate of his role by becoming a nomadic teacher. A concrete philosophy of education intends to lead out, ex duco, education ex duco, out, lead out in Latin. And this step is achievable only in a process of pure immanence, where the human is a singularity among others, not individuality, not person, but singularity. Model of rhizomatic, the Deleuzian philosophy. The rejection of the humanity yoke promotes the overcoming of the notion of person, because it is an a priori concept, an absolutism that has led to domination over the planet, with consequences that endanger the vital core of the earth. Precisely, from the schools at all levels, a post-humanistic education must reject any human originality, the concept of human nature, from Machiavelli, Spinoza, through Spinoza, to Marx and others. Opening itself to a constructivism for which man is a later construction, artificiality, a purely material body that is plurally linked to the concatenations of life. And thus he builds himself up, educates, or comes out. Traditional spiritualistic education maintains hierarchies, roles, and strategies of domination by turning education towards an absolute interiority devoid of a word. On the contrary, educating for posteriority means arriving at thought in the dimension of the outside work of Michel Foucault. To the thought is fervent. This is a new ecosophical challenge of the world, where the natural plan of pure materiality and the artificiality of educational construction can be founded together. The plane is the same. The players in this plane, the others, linked. The philosophical references installed in the French thought of the second half of the 20th century, Foucault, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Klossowski, Jacques Derrida, in the contemporary reading of Braidotti, Don Haraway, Bellux, up to neuroscience, Kandel, Damasio. A post-humanistic pedagogy intends to show that the human is a modus, as Spinoza states. The substance and modus of a uniqueness that is made up of multiplicity. Educating to plurality, to deterritorialization, and reterritorialization means approaching the various expressive forms without closing them in a specialized horizon. Sectorialization is, in my opinion, the fundamental obstacle for education for posteriority, because it prevents links between fields of knowledge. Only physician, only philosopher, only Spinozist, Machiavellist, expert of Derrida, close. For example, there are no dead languages. Attic Greek and Latin are the common root of different languages. The discoveries of anthropology concern epigenetics. Mathematical models must also be studied by linguists. A novel can dialogue with architecture and urban planning. Philosophy is the playing field where all the other protagonists play with different rules. Plant life is a central concept even for a computer programmer. The behavior of minerals can be transferred of the social dimension without metaphors. Nothing is atomized because if the place of the human being is the question that it can be exercised anywhere. A transversal knowledge is a fundamental ethical objective goal to counter the serious repercussion of this period marked by the virus. The boredom of young people, students, is only a request for commitment for us teachers. It is an opening to the passion for knowledge. In my opinion, the institutes aim to be an active cultural and critical avant-garde, a collective of unity in difference. Like Nietzsche in the three metamorphoses in whose spoke Zarathustra, initially the man is a camel. Everything is a burden to carry, a dominion to undergo. Knowledge is a way to become a lion. The second stage, the one who breaks slavery through understanding. And in the end, the return of the child is the pedagogy of the other, the expression of freedom in knowledge as a producer of meaning. The example of a snake and shepherd, the vision and the enigma in Zarathustra. Camus recalls that the transformative power in sense of potentia, potestas, of the word is a power in antiquity and contemporaneity, a force of the past that builds the future. The pedagogy of the future is not the universal humanistic man, or every idea of anthropocentrism, but man as a particle of the universe without dominion or supremacy. Starting from knowledge, the pandemic and the climate crisis show us that sustainable culture is possible, that ecosophy, philosophy and ecology, ecosophy is the value to be developed. Man was the only animal to destroy his habitat. We need to return to inhabit the planet, starting from the culture of the earth, in becoming between nature and man, in theory. Pedagogy and philosophy seem to share the path towards a new global method that is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary perspective. A search for the path, metaudos, in Greek, that brings back the Greek sense of the activity of thinking. Search for verum, not veritas. Veritas vertical, verum immanence. And the creation and the recreation of concept, operations that, even if you give another name, will always be philosophy. Gilles Deleuze in Qu'est-ce que c'est la philosophie? The life of the concept of encyclopedia, created by the Illuminists in this period, must once again be active in the words culture and educational locations. We must return to the encyclopedia in a nomadic, plural, multiple sense. The passage that circulates knowledge and reaches everyone. This is the profound meaning of encyclopedia. En, eg, in, kyklos, circular, prospective, interprospective, paideia, led out, ex duco, as well as the letting out. Umberto Eco reminded us that the web can be a trap and provide a false encyclopedia without selection. Post-2020 teaching task will be to bring back the clarity of philosophy in every aspect. A cure for what is clear, not mystical, that our young people urgently need. Why education once again? Why still education? Education again, yes. A post-humanistic education against all dogmatism. A nomadic itinerary that crosses the past and creates the future. Hybridizations, multiplicity, ex post subjectivity. Posteriority is a situated concept. It looks back, revolutionizes itself and builds its own artificiality. The concept of future is not the concept of posteriority. The followers of the future erase the past, live the eternity of updating, a present without perspective. In my opinion, the pedagogy of posteriority links Thucydide and the physics of quanta, Joyce and architecture, Boulez and Leopardi, chemistry and Dickens. We can be discipline specialists, but we must always be interdisciplinary. The effort is greater, but the result is very important for me. The knowledge of posteriority is transversal, molecular, rhizomatic. It goes beyond sectorialization. Posteriority is the education of the new post-humanist subjectivity. Thanks.
Thank you, Alberto. Now it is time for Nevena Mitranic to give her presentation.
Okay, I think this
you
working.
have
Okay.
already figured out.
Just for them to let the presentation, so forgive me, I'm going to do my talking while standing. This might be a bit of chaotic and anxious presentation. Now, I often prepare quite precisely for what I'm going to talk about, for how many sentences, at what number of minutes, but this time I kind of half intentionally and half by necessity left this unfinished. So if I start panicking or if there's a need for me to jump to the computer and get this back on track, better to be standing. I kind of assumed that on this conference there will be a lot of great theoreticians and a lot of great theoretical concepts, a lot of great complex stories that we're going to talk about. And I wanted to give us an opportunity for something a bit more relaxed and to share something that bit sound more like a personal story. And although it sounds relaxed, nice ideas have their ways to make themselves complicated. So this presentation kind of became a chaos itself, and I'm going to need your help in delivering it. As you can see on this slide, these are 4, let's call them topics, or even better experiences, I wanted to talk about. But if I talk about all 4 of them, we're going to stay here like half of the night. So, first one is mandatory, it is like introduction, but on other 3, we should choose what we shall going to talk about. And you can see that every one of them has some questions, and I promise you they have some ethical dilemmas, some issues, some spicy personal details, so whatever we choose, I hope it will be okay. Here you have a link, and you have a code, and even better, you have a QR code, which will lead you to the multiple choice question. I hope that everyone connected to the internet. If you have troubles with internet, you can work in pairs. Now, I will play us a song, and you will have time while song is lasting so that you can think about what you want to hear about, and we will hear the results later. So conference. So we can see the results, I hope, now. So let's see what you chose to talk about. Maybe you need to refresh it or something. Okay. Ooh, kind of expected that one. Okay, so we're talking about diffracting theory practice. Back to the presentation, please. So I said we'll first talk something introductory. I didn't want this to be a theoretical presentation, but I assume that some people might not be familiar with certain concepts, so I'll just try to give a brief introduction of what we're doing here. So, not the Beatles again, so I'll skip it, okay? First of all, diffraction. Now, before I start, I have a need to state that I do not claim that I understand and know and use properly the word diffraction. Now that's kind of a big problem with words in science, generally speaking. Like words have certain definitions, certain precise meanings, certain ways of being used in certain contexts. And although this sort of post and trans and queer and turbo and whatever theories we use these days are not so cruel on that matter, they are not really making it easier for us, aren't they? Like you saw the agenda for the conference. There are a lot of rhythms and cyborgs and transhumanities, and I expected more nomads and war machines and lines of light, and we don't even going to mention the bodies without organ. So, and probably those words don't mean what we think they mean. So it's kind of risky when you use them. Are you doing it in a proper way? And if I understand things correctly, what is beautiful about these words and concepts and theories is that the point is that they do not mean by themselves, isolated and per se have some sort of meaning, but they kind of function, and it depends on the constellation in which you get them and the ways you use them, how will they work. But there's always a question, are we putting them in a good constellations and are we actually using them in a good function? So it's kind of always discussable. And so, talking about diffraction, I will try to explain how I understand the term. Now, for those who do not know, diffraction is quantum phenomena, so it comes from quantum physics, and it explains the behavior of waves when they meet an obstacle or a slit. And on the picture, you can see the example where two waves meet, and what happens in between, in the point of their meeting, is that they create a new pattern. So it's not the pattern of the first wave, not the pattern of the second wave, but something new is being created in their meeting. So it's called a pattern of interference. So the idea is that waves, while meeting or coming to an obstacle or something, make another different patterns. And why is that important for quantum physics? Well, if you know physics, and I don't, so I will try to explain it, it seems that for classical physics, particles are one thing and waves are the other things, and they kind of don't match with each other. But what quantum physics show is that particles can also sometimes show diffraction. So they behave like waves. And when they start playing on that idea, they kind of saw that particles can behave like waves and waves can behave like particles, but not depending on their substance or some of their characteristics, but depending on the very ways that we as researchers look at them. So it is based on our research apparatus. The way that you approach them shapes their ways of behavior. And why is that important for social sciences, humanities? Two things are important here. First thing which is of importance, I will just slide this out, I don't know why I put it. First thing which is important is that you kind of understand that everything might be seen as a movement, as a wave, and that we can see everything as a pattern of interference, something that becomes in the meeting of forces. And the other thing is important, and that is that we as scientists, by the very ways which we approach some phenomena, shape that phenomena always and already. When we do diffraction as methodology, we can see some different ways of doing that in some different aspects, I would say. Broadly speaking, we can see working with diffraction on theories. So we'll kind of, it's most often found in literature as diffractive reading. Like you take texts from different theorists, or take different theoretical ideas and try to bring them into relation, to read them through each other and to see what new kind of interferences, what new patterns, new ideas may come out of that relation. The other way of doing that, also commonly used way, is diffracting data. It's some sort of diffractive analysis where we stretch quite broadly what we understand as a text, that stretch quite broadly what we understand as a reading, and stretch quite broadly what we understand as a data. And we try to work with what we consider to be data and with some theories to bring them into relation and see what might happen with that. You see that diffraction is kind of very creative scientific practices, so we are not getting to come to some sort of objective knowledge. It is impossible. We saw that we always already shape the phenomena. So if we shape the phenomena, we try to use that creativity in a productive way to produce some new differences, which might, let's say, make a world a better place. And the least explicit way of using diffraction as a methodology is what you chose, diffracting theory practice. And I found only a couple of papers which write about this quite explicitly as a methodology. But if you start looking the world through these diffractive lenses, you kind of start to understand that if you're working some sort of a field work, like you're going to some institution, doing your research there, you understand that your ways of engaging there, being there, are always already shaped by what you read and theories with which you approach to that practice. But also that practice is always shaping what you're reading, what you choose to read next. So the theory shapes your practical engagements, but your practical engagements and insights from practice shape the understanding of the theories. And of course, being young and naive and ambitious and stupid as I was when I began my research, I kind of decided I should try to do all of them. And it's quite difficult when you're a beginner and when you see interference in one thing and you start seeing it everywhere. It's hard when you saw something not to see it and to choose to do only one thing and not all of them. So that's kind of where all hell breaks loose. And why did I choose to do diffraction? Now it is important to say, I am pedagogue. It's some sort of educational sciences for those who are not from the countries who have pedagogy. And my field of research is preschool education, early childhood education, and my research focus was play. And it's important to mention that in Belgrade, on our department, we have quite alternative, quite contemporary for these times understanding of play. We don't see it as something that's activity, something that can be caught in time and space, something that only children does. We saw it more as a capacity of flexibility, capacity for transformation, as movement, as intensity. And that's something that we have in our theories for decades ago. And what bothered me when I started researching play was the fact that we have these theories for like 50 years and more. And we have them intertwined into our legal documents, so into our politics, into our curricula. We always had kind of alternative and good understanding of play. And when you talk with people, scientists or practitioners, we kind of all know what a play is and it is kind of important. But what we do with that is not what we talk about. And I kind of didn't understand why that happens. If we are so smart when we're talking, why are not we doing that? And when you read the literature from our region, why is that happening? There's a lot of critiques that practitioners don't really understand what a play is. But when I was reading the literature of play, I kind of came to the idea that maybe we scientists also don't quite understand what the play is, because the ways we do science in relation to play is always putting it back to categories, back to some sort of behaviors that we can understand, that we can explain in an educational manner. And that's the same thing that kindergarten teachers do. Like we kind of understand its flexibility, transformation, intensity, but they have to prove that it has some educational value, that it can be put into some categories that I can write about in articles I can publish after. So the ways we do science about play very much shape what we understand about the play, but also how the play is being realized in kindergarten institutions. So that was the reason why I thought that I will not get to anything new if I don't change the way that we do the research of play. And for that kind of research to be really following on play, it needs to be playful as well. So it needs to be something that is transformative and something that can be moving and that can work with intensities. So now we'll skip this part so that you can see what you're missing. To come to the topic you chose. So, diffracting theory and practice. Now, important thing to mention before I start with this one, I kind of bumped into Deleuze and Guattari on the first year of the studies, and it's important to say I have no background in that. We don't learn that on our faculty, and we learn quite a little about post-movements on any sorts, and we certainly do not do diffraction and post-qualitative methodologies on our studies. So I kind of bumped into that, and reading it, of course I didn't understand a thing, but I had a feeling that there might be something that might open up the old theories of ours for some new understanding and some different ways of engagement. So when I needed to go to kindergarten to do my research, having no background, I didn't really know what should I be doing there. Like understanding play as a transformation, as flexibility, as a movement, as intensity, as something that can happen anytime, anywhere. When I go to kindergarten, what do I look at? Should I look at everything? Should I catch up on everything? It was really difficult. Like my focus was micro moments of everyday practices. Beautiful. Where do you see that? So I was really bothered with the idea, how will I catch a thing? So I tried to understand how the other people do it, but as I mentioned before, this is the least written, least explicit way of doing diffraction, so there's quite a little literature on it. And I found the article with some sort of guidelines, which say you focus on microprocesses. Okay, check, we did that. Not on the grand narratives, beautiful. But we still don't know what we're looking at. You do not establish a priori categories, so we will not say this is play and this is learning, this is, I don't know, children, this is adults. We will kind of start where we are and see what goes on. And beautiful, like we all feel it beautiful, but what do I do with that? So it's still looking that we are kind of researching everything. Research process should not be focused on some sort of goals or pre-established questions, but it should be a process of transformation of relations. So does it mean that I'm actually researching relations? But no, I kind of said in my proposal that I'm researching play. But if we step into relational ontologies, like everything is relations, and it is correct, but when you start working on this sort of assumptions, everything starts coming into your focus of the research. So for example, I'm kind of finishing it right now, hopefully. And in my thesis, you have play, but also you have religion, you have politics, you have charisma, you have shamans, you have death, you have a lot of topics, and you can just imagine the delight of my mentor working with me. So it becomes kind of difficult to work with this sort of theories. Now, we here all might understand each other, and we might say that this is completely fine. But when you try to do it in the academia, in your official thesis, it's kind of problematic. It should be more focused and more of a science. And design should be open for transformation. Beautiful. And it really puts you in some sort of pressure that at the field, at every moment, you should be so focused. You should be so open to catch any possibility that might be opened up. And you, for first couple of months, I had a feeling that I just cannot be everywhere. And I had an urge to be everywhere with the children, because micro moments, beautiful micro moments, events, happen all the time around us. Can we see them or not? And if I don't see them, am I to blame? Other reason why it was important for me to go into practice with this sort of flexible framework, if there was a framework at all, was the very fact that I had no background in the theories I was working with. Now, if I understand things correctly, I read that idea a long time ago, that you do not understand this sort of things by reading of them and by trying to define them, but by trying to work with them. So however irresponsible it might seem to work with something you don't really know, do we ever actually know what we're working with? The only way for me to learn was to try to actually do something with it. So I tried to engage in a practice with all of it. But when you come to the idea to maybe take a look at what other people are doing, to maybe have an idea or two of what you might be doing with the children, I came to the problem because lots of the practices in this field of work are artistic practices or are being done in some sort of informal or non-formal educational context, like some sort of workshops once or twice a week, once in a 2 week with a chosen group. And I'm not working once or twice a week. I'm not even working in a specific time frame. I'm there entire day. And during the entire day, I should catch something that's always already happening somewhere. And I'm not working with a chosen group of people, I'm working with kindergarten teachers and with children who are in that group. And of course, everyone gave their, everyone accepted to be a part of the research, they were informed, but that's sort of a problem. I don't know if that's the next slide, yes it is. It's sort of the problem, because when you try to explain to the people, and I really tried, to explain that this is not like the research that you used to. There will no be interviews and focus groups and something like that, questionnaires. I will be a part of the group, I will follow what you do, like work with you, we will try to do something creative together. They all say, okay, fine. But when you come to the kindergarten, they kind of have some sort of expectance of what the researchers should be and how you should behave. For the first 2 months, they look at me as I'm some sort of a spy or something, like I'm just pretending to be researching and actually I'm looking what they're doing, and I wasn't doing that. They didn't kind of believe me, and when I tried to engage with them to do something creative, to take a look at something what happened and maybe think together about it, I came to the problem, and that's probably a cultural problem, maybe a global problem, that they still have kind of established hierarchies of what the researcher is. And when I say, like, probably we should try to do that, they say, okay, just say and we will do it. And I was like, no, this doesn't function that way. So we have like months and months of, and it lasts for only 6 months. And 4 months passed in that trying to get together and do something creative together. Also, I had the trouble of explaining them what I'm actually researching. Like, that was the worst question ever while I was doing my research, when someone asked me, what are you actually researching and how do you do research? Like, don't ask me. Because when I say I research play, when I told the kids that I research play, they start talking about the play quite poorly, quite on the way that they are used to play should be seen. Like, when you ask children, what do you like to play? They will say, oh, mothers and babies, and we play in the kitchen, and we like to play hide and seek. And I saw them playing, and I play with them, and it's much richer than that. But they will always talk in the discourse they learned about, and they will talk having the expectancy of what we see that play is. So it was very difficult to get together and do. And what stayed with me is one of the worst issues was the problem of participation, which we kind of mentioned on this day a couple of times. Because of that lack of possibility for understanding, and mostly because of the rush, what Professor Taylor mentioned this morning, like, you refused to rush, and I didn't. I was kind of in a rush. We had issues of including all the perspectives. Like, most of the time I tried to respond to children or to kindergarten teachers very performatively. Like, they do something, I don't have time and I don't still have means to communicate that with them, but I assume that it might be something and I try to answer performatively on that and see what happens. So most of the research went on that way, and I can argue theoretically that that is correct. Like, you have, Masumi has the explanation of in What Animals Teach Us About Politics, of that sort of performativity in play. And in many research you can find that as being right, but I still stay kind of bothered. Was that just my interpretation and they go with the flow, or was that, okay, I'm finishing soon. Or was it maybe something different? So that's sort of a problem of participation. And what I mentioned with this rush is the problem of time, and I assume that a lot of us might find ourselves in that sort of a struggle. We're working in the institutional frameworks or any other frameworks. Like, you have some time to be on a field, you have some time to finish your research process, and you're always kind of in a hurry. And for most of the times that happened here, and most of the problems that opened, I see that they might function differently if we had more time. If we had more time to get used to each other, if we had more time to come back to some things. Now, you can always ask me, why didn't you come back? You could come back after 6 months and ask them, was that like, here we can see how different levels intertwine to make situation complicated. Now, this happened in 2019. Children were preschool group, so they went to school. No more children a couple of months after I left. And we all know what happened in 2020. So no more kindergarten to come back to. And of course, there's always a level of a person, which we cannot kind of exclude. I must admit that I was kind of puzzled and embarrassed, and I didn't know how to come and force them to talk to me about what I consider to be important and what I consider to be needed. If they have this sort of perspective, this is just something that should be done. And we will skip through this because you didn't choose it as well, to come back to the conclusions, some sort of conclusions. I will not go through all of them. I will mention just this last one. And this even shouldn't be the conclusion, but it might also be some sort of diffraction. The very fact that the organization put me in this session of desubjektivation, I was like, I didn't want to talk about that. But when you mentioned it, it seems kind of puzzling that in all these post-humanities and transhumanities we always talk about, it seems that we always kind of keep coming back to the question of us. When you look at the methodological suggestions for how we do this sort of research, they're always kind of subjective, like you should be sensitive, you should be open, you should listen, you should be effective. And what I ask of kindergarten teachers is kind of the same. It's their sensibility, it's their responsibility. And what do we ask of the children at the end of the educational process? Probably quite the same. We want to develop their sensibility, their responsibility. So we always keep coming back on that question. So it was kind of fun to me to play with that idea that we often talk how we are maybe too human for all these post-human perspectives, but it might be that maybe we are not human enough, because this sort of approach seems to ask for a lot of bravery, a lot of patience, a lot of wisdom, which we kind of don't have and which is kind of hard to develop. And we can say that, of course, there can be some systemic measures. We can work collectively. We can develop that kind of structures which will support you through this process. But that structures won't fall out of the sky. Someone has to make them. And that someone is also coming back to us. So I will leave you on that question and in the time.
Thank you, Nevena, very much for this refreshing, inspiring, odd presentation. You're confirming this is my favorite session, not only because it is the last one. So we have a last participant final participant for today, but not less important. So Stefan, please.
Thank you. Should I stay here or where do you put me? Is that okay? Okay. Thank you for staying so long today. 2021 has seen a premiere of one quite interesting play in Berlin, Schönborn Theater. You might have seen this. This is the play called "It's Not the End of the World." This is a quite interesting depiction of what the so-called climate climate catastrophe is doing nowadays. It is infiltrated in our everyday language, and this play explores quite an interesting story on one postdoctoral student, Anna Fogel, who is quite ambitious and wants to get her postdoc at the Professor Oberhoff, who's sitting here. Most of the show, she's sitting there. But this play is quite interesting in terms of what and how the director, Katie Mitchell, has organized this show and what was the main and principal motive. So this play explores the catastrophic events that are coming to us. This is climate change. But it explores it in a way that it conflicts the possible universes or uses the idea of the multiverses. So the two main protagonists of this story constantly change and switch their roles. They are constantly new characters in each new act. For example, Anna Fogel explains that in one sense that she has children, that professor says that she doesn't have a children, and they switch. And the entire show ends with the huge and enormous question, are these phases of the human possible to adapt, to situate within what is huge, gigantic reality of hyperobject? So, Not the End of the World uses the idea, which is quite popular nowadays and was popularized by the speculative realist movement. And my talk today will specifically concentrate on what the object-oriented ontology and speculative realism has to say regarding the knowledge. I'm not the educational expert by myself. I'm a sociologist, which is quite odd to watch the plays and to talk about these kind of new philosophical movements. But what is quite impelling with this new speculative realist movement is that they go beyond a usual buzzword of relations or relationality. Relationality has, to a certain extent, become a quite used notion in our everyday conduct as a social scientist and in humanities as well. And it has become refuge from a notion of the substance. So you might see here just a couple of good examples of these new schools emerging, and that are concentrated specifically on studying relations, something that makes and creates, so to say, ontogenesis of the entities that are being involved here. So for example, relational sociologists will ask you which transactions do you enter, or which kind of structures determine your structural relations, determine your, for example, music preferences, whereas relational geographers will ask you, do you have suffice infrastructures that reach in your neighborhood, etc. These new schools, and specifically the multinaturalism and perspectivism in anthropology, and of course, inevitably, actor network theory and symmetrical anthropology, have all displayed this new idea on entities being somehow related to each other. However, what the object-oriented ontologists did is that they actually scrutinized this widely accepted idea on relation. So this is the quote from one of its main and most productive proponents, Graham Harman, who says that what makes OOO, object-oriented ontology, different from these currents of thought is the idea that objects never make full contact with each other any more than they do with the human mind. So what is quite interesting here, that against such theories, is that OOO defends the idea that objects, whether real, fictional, natural, artificial, human, non-human, are mutually autonomous and enter into relation only in special cases that need to be explained rather than assumed. So this is, quite disturbing thought, to think that there is always something more beyond that we might not know. And this is also something which comes as a huge intellectual provocation of this whole new current in philosophy. So let me briefly just summarize for a moment what they're saying, since they have quite, let's say, imperialistic tendencies to call themselves a new theory of everything, going quite contrary, for example, the string theory of Brian Greene in physics. So the OOO is probably one of the most post-anthropocentric currents in nowadays in probably philosophy and beyond, and it is deposited on the dismissal of so-called correlationism. This is the idea, of course, of Quentin Michaud, French philosopher, and who actually departed that all Kantian, specifically the Kantian question of the access to the reality. OOO specifically focuses on the objects, and objects are quite indefinite. They're not definable easily. So objects are everything. They're the synonym for the entities, and they focus on their relationship properties, and they also impose quite an interesting assumption on undisclosed and withdrawn realities, and they emphasize the aesthetic approach. Aesthetic approach is quite important here because it almost completely dismisses what we usually have in our debates on the Anthropocene. So debates on the Anthropocene have, to a most extent, have been concentrated not only on the indication of the human ecological footprint, but also have engendered the questions of attuning to a radical climate uncertainty driven by a non-human agency, primarily. There are various attempts, of course, to situate and to engage with what some sociologists and anthropologists call the metabolic materiality. So there are, for example, heterodox economy of degrowth modeling, speculative post-politics, but also there are various experiments that want to build a broader pragmatics for encountering the ontological anxiety. They're coming with a more than human existence. These here, what is this, a table or something like that, are, one of the principal points of how to access this kind of a huge undisclosed reality. For example, even though they're related to each other, for example, the others who are insistent on the concept of resilience are intending to see it as a counterweight to modernist conceptions of control and power. There's also the talks on posthuman subjectivity as embodied, embedded, and effective entity. But there are also calls to retrieve the good old thematic of the apocalypse, as Bruno Latour or Deepish Chakrabarty or Vivieros de Castro are doing nowadays. But all of these appeals actually concentrate on the, actually the name of this panel is the ethics. But the OOO concentrates on the aesthetics and switches that question of the human access to a broader reality to quite intricate entanglements. So let me briefly summarize, if possible, this huge definition of the object that they're using. So objects, first and foremost, are irreducible. So object means nothing more than a unified thing that cannot be exhaustively reduced either to its components or its effects. It always has something more beyond it. It is non-intentional. Objects are not derivatives or opposites to subjects. And this is the principal distinction which they see and to which they do criticize most of the so-called posthumanist scholarship as well, telling that the posthuman scholarship also keeps the good old partition between the subject and object. There are also proponents of realism, saying that all objects, whether physical, fictional, are real, but they're not symmetrical. And this is a quite important point of the disjunction with the actor network theory, who sees the symmetry between the entities. It is the question that they pose, for example, to Bruno Latour. Will the volcano, are we symmetrical with the volcano, for example? Are we symmetrical with the huge coronavirus as well? So humans are not symmetrical to those kind of entities and formations. There's also more than human experience, and they insist quite a lot on these experiential point that various objects, even stones, use in situating in their own environments and relating to their own environments. There's autonomy, and autonomy is quite important. Objects are autonomous to a relative degree, so not necessarily they're related to each other. So, for example, Graham Harman specifically attacks what he calls the holistic philosophies, the usual holistic philosophies, which see and derive whole reality from one metaphysical principle, assuming it is immediately related, that all entities come under some umbrella, for example. And at the end, objects are entangled. So they appear at various scales and of temporality and spatiality. So these, most popular notions such as symbiosis, hyperobjects, and machines are the concepts and the notions that these triple O philosophers use in order to describe how the objects are immersed into each other. For example, here's the definition from the Timothy Morton, also one of the most productive proponents from this school. Hyperobject is a thing so vast in both temporal and spatial terms that we can only see slices of it at the time. Hyperobjects come in and out of phase with human time. They end up contaminating everything. If we find ourselves inside them, I'll call this phenomenon viscosity. Imagine all the plastic bags' existence at all. All of them, all that we will ever exist everywhere. This heap of plastic bags is a hyperobject. It is an entity that is massively distributed in space and time in such a way that you obviously can only access small slices of it at a time. So, for example, what they use as points of where they use these concepts as the thing we abandoned a couple of months ago called the pandemic, for example, or the climate change itself. So it is the deep immersion of the object into different entities that are related to each other, but we don't ever know where the margins of it are. And we don't know the immediate properties of each one of it. So this is where we come to second quite important point of the OOO, which is that quite opposed to a usual formula, which is used also in a number of relational models, is that wholes are less than some of their parts, rather than vice versa. So their multiplicity of parts always exceed the whole, rather than the whole swallowing the parts perfectly. For example, Timothy Morden uses the example of Houston as a city. So when we say a Houston, we think of a huge whole, but when we get more deep into it, there are streets, there are a number of objects. So the whole is actually a simplification of a multiplicity of something that we put together as humans, but also as other objects put those things together. They stick to each other, and sticking is also one of the verbs that Morton likes. So coherence is also one important phenomenon, is when the parts really overlap, so they become the same thing. Define the idea of regular differences among parts between the parts and the whole. Human body is a good example of that, for example, when immersion of different objects also relates to each other. Substance is the notion which Morton also develops, and it implies that both wholes and parts are equally real. So when we see, for example, Dublin in James Joyce's novels is also a real thing. So the fictional entities are no less real than those which are simply materialized. So they correspond, but they open and get close to a certain extent. There are endo-relations and exo-relations. This is quite clear. So that there are dynamic ensemble of relations between what is confined as an entity and what is beyond that entity. And there are also temporal and spatial traits of these ensembles imply a huge amount of withdrawn beings. So this is a simplification of a model here. So as Graham Harman is saying, we should abandon what he calls undermining and overmining. That is usually in talks on objects. So undermining is that when we actually dismiss their power to act, to exist, etc. And overmining is also to see their excessive power. But what he thinks is where the reality is situated is in these axes, this diagonal axis, where the real objects and the real qualities emerge or encounter the sensual objects and sensual qualities. And this is quite important for this X here, undisclosing and disclosing. So the various objects that we could assess and that give us access are actually only essential qualities. So my cell phone is most of it is just a sensual apparatus, and I don't know how the chips work. I don't know how it retrieves the data, etc., etc., etc. But it's also one object. It's also in a hyper object called the mobile network, which is in a hyper object called my telephone company, etc. But these objects, since they can act, they have power to act, they also disclose and undisclose. So this is a quite important thing, and probably one of the most interesting points where they develop an old idea of Bruno Latour on black boxes, that is the small confined entities or realities. They're stabilized partially, but can erupt anytime. So this is when we come to this most disturbing point of the OOO. This is the surplus reality. As you can see in this exploration from French architects, this quite interesting studio from Paris, this is the experiment on the object-oriented ontology, which tells that it always might be something beyond. They let the spider to weave the networks and to relate and make some hyper object here. But what we always have as a lack is that there are withdrawn non-relational aspects of beings that give a birth to uncertainty, because the surplus reality might implode anytime. As Harman underscores, in order for something to break, this is in, not n, order for something to break, it must contain a stubborn surplus beneath its current effects and impacts, a surplus that one day erupts like a symptom and demands that we take it seriously. So this surplus reality is quite challenging thing. Specifically when we see how are they seeing some of the political traits or political program as object-oriented ontology. So first and foremost, they do confine knowledge practices to only and relate them only as an indirect access to reality and local manifestations. We could never ever have or achieve as humans some broad wishful thinking to have the idea of reaching to entire reality. This is a first point. So the knowledge production, as they say, cannot be the sole or even primary purpose of education. And this isn't completely dismissing an education. This is the attuning the education to this second point. So the aesthetic as the primary access point. There is a strength in metaphor. So in order to unveil many aspects of those that mystified reality is to use different metaphors, different fictional objects, different fictional entities in order to fill the rifts between the real objects and their sensual qualities. As you may see this quote here, and I will stop with the quotes, art shows us disturbingly ambiguous pretense woven into aesthetic experience. Wonderment is based on the capacity to be deceived. The more we are okay with being lied to, the wiser we might become, says Timothy Morton. And this brings us to, well, quite risky politics. I'm ending here. So this quite risky point on politics. Politics goes without knowledge, and this is quite stubborn insistence of the Graham Harman. So he says that politics is a matter of dispute rather than being a matter of some factual knowledge, something that we could retrieve in that good old-fashioned naturalist epistemology thing. And politics comes as a matter of associations. Politics is also a thing, how do we attune ourselves to other beings? So this hyper beings, let's call them in that way. But there are 3 points that I want to stress here. I don't have any kind of a specific conclusion, but 3 possible dangers. It never stops is the end of the quote, also from Timothy Morton. And when he says that our way of accessing those that huge mutating contingent world of specifically of climate change is that we always have to adapt. This well, rather fatalistic approach also comes as a dawn of post-critical era, and this is what has been assessed by a number of authors who have been criticizing the post-critical authors of retaining every capability of humans to be attached or just to relate in terms of, for example, care. This is a quite important concept nowadays. So it is only the attunement that is coming as kind of a fear of something that is beyond us. There's also a point which is quite important from a point of view of pragmatic sociology. It is a conflict between the world and reality. So the world is something which is full of events and which might erupt at any time. This is for example, the pandemic. And reality are the frames that we use as humans. So symbolic constructions, good old fabulations on how do things work. So we never ever have been accessing, for example, the pandemic at its entirety. But the thing is that we used also conspiracy theories to explain to ourselves what is going on. We Googled the data, etc. So the problem is whether this assumption from the O theorists is good for making a proper frameworks for engaging with the menacing world. And also, there's a matter of the divergence. The other authors, such as Isabel Stengeris and Marilyn Stratton, use the notion of non-relationality in quite a different way. They say it is a point where different worlds emerge. For example, for us as scientists, as philosophers, we enter in a specific relation with objects. But for example, for an Amazonian tribe to enter to a relation with the tree, with the forest, with the Amazon rainforest, is quite different from our ways of access. And this point of the divergence is also quite an important thing in political terms, how to come up with, whether we might deploy the knowledge and how to come up with that diplomatic policies in order to find a broader truce in this, well, let's say, again, menacing world. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I'm impressed with the rhetorics and with the presentation. Okay, I'm now opening up the question part. I hope that enthusiasm that you adopt or enthusiasm from the participants. So please, do we have any questions? Okay, one.
Thank you to all of you. My question is specifically for, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Nevena? Nevena. I was wondering how your research, I think it's a general question about the presentation, how your research affected your understanding of the relationship between education and play. If you're seeing those two as like in this methodology of diffraction as sort of two waves, and then you're looking at the pattern that comes out of their intersection, or are they, because you're looking at play specifically in schools, right?
In kindergartens.
In kindergartens.
Yeah.
So does the play that happen in the kindergarten, do you think differs from the play that happens, that doesn't happen in kindergartens, or what is that relationship between play and education, or the school, the kindergarten that you see happening?
Well, thank you for the question. I mentioned that we have quite good theories on play already, so we don't kind of see play as an activity or something separated from learning from the very beginning. We have the theories that claim play as a capacity of flexibility in action, and capacity of flexibility as the main human capacity. Now, that was 50 years ago, so that there was no posthumanism then. So as the main capacity, it should be at the center of education, and that is something we're trying to work with. But what bothered me was the fact how we understand the flexibility. And being so humanly focused and so unable to step us out of the categorization, and being focused on some symbolic play and some very recognizably cultural forms of play, we kind of always skipped how this flexibility opened up new ways of understanding what learning and education might be. So for me, in the very process of doing research, I actually tried to work with how the flexibility function in practice. So when I tell you that play is capacity of flexibility, like, what do you do with that? You don't know how it might look like. And I tried to understand that, to kind of feel that, and from that feeling I kind of very broadened understanding what we might learn and how we might become together. Because for example, I had that perspective more focused on that transformation, flexibility, movement, and play is that. But in practice, I started seeing how play is also some sort of coming back to structures, making new structures, making something new, and that always depends on working with others. So that importance of reterritorializing, coming back to things, making new territories was something that's important for me. And I think that is important for education as well, if I answered the question. Bueno, mislim da ima još jedan.
But then when is it, like, is it ever only education, or only play, or is every play that happens in the kindergarten also educational, or like, are they?
Well, that is a tough question, because we are trying to move outside of the boundaries and binaries, aren't we? So it's difficult to say what is educational. Can I say what is educational for you? Or can you say what is educational for me? Is educational the result or the opportunity for experience? We don't know what the results might be. Even in the formal education, we kind of set up the goals and we set up some sort of standards, but the fact that we set them up doesn't mean that they are really established in practice. So what we are trying to work more is to consider educational the very opportunity to open up experiences. And what will happen after kind of depends. So it is a difficult question.
I wanted to add a little bit to that, because I think your concept of what is play is really helpful, and something I'm going to bring back with me to our institution, because I think there's been a big interest in games, game-based learning, but a lot of skepticism as well, because games and play are often conflated with like fun and entertainment. So I'm wondering what you see as the relationship between play and those concepts of like fun, and is that a misinterpretation, or is play inherently fun? Because I think that's an assumption that some faculty I've worked with, or people I work with and talk with, it's kind of an assumption that's made.
Yeah, we often consider play to be like all fun and games, and you see that in English you have that difference. We don't have it in Serbian between play and games. That's not the same thing. So often when we talk about bringing play into education, people consider it bringing games into education, and they make educational games, like we'll make a quiz and we'll make something with bubbles and the colors, and you will click and you will learn numbers. And that is not what we talk about, the potential of play. it depends on how we understand play. If we understand it as flexibility, as movement, transformation, like, is it always nice? Like, we all kind of played, and we know that it's not always nice. It's not always fun. It can be disturbing. It can be troubling. It can be difficult. But play cannot be really looked at as a feeling that continues through a certain period of time. Like, in some moments you enjoy, in others you kind of struggle. So it's kind of banalization to consider it only to be fun. If we focus on that point of movement and uncertainty, not really knowing what we do, but we follow something because we feel it might be important and kind of interest us, and it is troubling, it is sometimes bothering, but it can be educational at the end.
I hope I'm not monopolizing you, but it was a question I had building off of your question. I was thinking the form of game that I associate most with children comes from psychoanalytic theory, the idea that you are able to relationalize absence and presence through game, right? Like the Fortdarspiel that Freud describes, the child throwing the toy out of the crib and then saying, it's gone, it's back. This is pre-kindergarten, pre-schooling, pre-learning game, has everything to do with desire, and I think also with being able to conceptualize these things. So to me, there's a strong binary implicated in playing in games that comes before we begin to, because I have a daughter who is in kindergarten, and the way that it's described to me always is that children can only learn through play. It's the only form that's the only thing that they can do. You can't talk to a child, explain something to them, have a discursive, but it's through games. But before the actual socialization process in school, you have games doing something else, right? Like creating world images. And it has something to do with desire and with yeah. I was curious whether that affects your actual analysis of games, looking only at kindergarten children.
If the question is the fact that I'm working with kindergarten children, that is my field of research. I'm early childhood education research, so I don't work on other levels. Now, when you ask about desire, it really depends on how we understand desire. Like, do we look at it like psychoanalytically, or are we going to take a more Deleuzian approach to what desire is? So if we take a Deleuzian approach of desire being the creative force of creating something out of what we sense and follow, and no, I do not follow psychoanalytical approach, so it's kind of difficult for me to maybe answer on this question. Of course, you have this anthropological research that show how the previous cultures often used rituals to explain some things for them, because embodiment was what they have as a tool for understanding the world. Like, you cannot verbalize something, you cannot understand something, you can only act as that thing, you can only impression that sort of thing. So that's maybe something that children also do. Like, you go to the doctor, you get the vaccine or something, and you're kind of troubled, you don't really understand what's going on to you, so when you come home you just take the vaccine and give it to your teddy bear. So that's what children do, but I do not consider it to be some sort of a trauma or issue or something that should be solved. It's more of a lot of things in the world troubles us, and we don't have the tools to understand them, and we have the need to do something with them, and we create something out of them. So maybe that's the part of desire working in the play. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
I don't want to monopolize your time. There are other speakers.
Thank you for keeping us awake now at the end of the day, which was very exciting. So I work with Nevena at the Department for Pedagogy and Andragogy, and also working within the post-human paradigm, let's say. So I wonder the difficulties, but this might be a question for all speakers. I wonder if while you work doing your research by following these ideas and concepts, I wonder the difficulties you faced are basically the difficulties of translating results you have into expected ideas of what doctoral research should be. So there is no in academia, especially at our university, we use only words and numbers in order to show some results. So I wonder if you would create different kind of, I don't know, as you said, artistic practice or any other way that you find more appropriate. Do you think you would still have these difficulties? Or they emerge from this tension that what I usually see is that we talk about post-humanist critical theory and approaches, but basically we do it in a very traditional way. So maybe a question for everyone, how we can overcome this discrepancy between what we talk and how we do conversations, research, presentations. So what do you think about it?
If I can answer first. That was part of the presentation, but you didn't choose to talk about diffracting data. So what I tried to do, I had that issue because what Maya says is that it is expected that you write your dissertation. And for me, the lucky thing was that I'm quite good at writing, and I was working, I did some fictional writing before. So I don't consider words to be the problem, but they should be used differently. And I tried to work with my data by making stories out of them. And they're more of fictional stories, sounding like fictional stories, really sticking to what really happened, what someone really said, what someone really did, but making them in a form which would be like you're reading some sort of novel or something, and then to diffract them with the theories. One trouble is the fact that some would say, for example, the professors, that it is not a discourse for a dissertation, so there's some sort of a struggling, but not so much. But the other problem is that I personally sometimes have a problem with that, because I'm not sure, am I making it up? Like, am I really respecting what happened? It is only like my view on what happened, and I'm trying to explain what I felt. It was affective research, a lot of this sort of research work on the affective intensities, affective ethnography. So, but what's the difference between affect of what I feel and what is like affective force in the situation? I'm not quite sure that I know how to work with that. So one problem is the institution, but maybe we could push the boundaries of the institution. It's always needed that some of us really do that and try out, even if we fail, but just to open up the doors for something to happen. But the trouble is, can we give ourselves that right and that bravery to do so if we are not sure what we are doing? And I assume that a lot of us who work with this are not quite sure what we are doing. You mentioned the results, and it's not so much of an issue to translate results. Of course, I cannot translate them into some sort of quantitative or something, and it wasn't asked out of me, and I must admit that. But the problem is that sometimes I cannot say what are the results. Like, we are not learned to this. We learned quantitative mostly and qualitative a little bit, but post-qualitative, no one learns you that. So when you read a lot of that literature, you yourself who believe in these things are not sure what are you actually reading to. So it seems that we have a lot of personal struggles to deal with. In the same time, while we should argue for opening the systems and institutions to be more flexible, and we're still not quite sure what we're doing. So it's a bit of a challenge.
Can I answer? Yeah. This turn on. Sorry.
So yeah, wow, this is quite complex question. But what I have in mind is, for example, the way the geographers and architects actually present their work, and this is the quite an interesting point of access to the world. And we have a beautiful and wonderful examples of attaining those links that we do not see. For example, from the Bruno Latour's associates, Alexander Aren, who's an architect, who made a marvelous representations of Gaia, or that concept that Bruno Latour retrieved recently in his recent work. And what they have in mind is actually this, what Nevena was also saying, what it comes to at the very end, enhancing our sensory apparatus. So being well, attuned to read something differently. And this is the problem which I think that any scientific endeavor actually engages when it comes to how to translate the data or to translate the inquiries. I don't want to call them data, let's call them inquiries. Yeah, it's way better, because inquiry is chaotic. So institutions want something, you know, from the official, legitimate science. How do you have to do stuff by the way of, you know, what they learn you at the postgraduate courses of methodology, which are the most boring thing ever. So they learn you to stick to some sort of a rules, right? So, but they don't allow the object that is being studied to learn from that object. And I think this is also a thing which is being discussed quite a lot in different ways. For example, you have that Andrew Abbott in sociology, who has that idiosyncratic vision of lyrical sociology, as he calls it. It is we have to be acquainted with how to talk the stories about the worlds. So worlds also have to tell the stories about them. Worlds have to disentangle. For example, when he speaks about the in his works on lawyers and the medical profession in the United States, he uses that method, which is quite unveiling, to say that it is quite different from to see the world from a perspective, for example, of a nurse who is trapped with the everyday emergency from somebody who's, let's say, associated some kind of a ministry of health, etc. So, but those worlds are linked, and you have to allow the stories to be linked, and you have to be patient. Unfortunately, I know how it is. I mean, especially when you're doing that kind of ethnography, when you have to be with the what do you study? I mean, I've done the ethnography for my PhD, and this is, well, troubling, at least. So this will be my answer. But I think that what gives us marvelous possibilities in our times is to use the digital tools as much as we can. So this is this is something what we have nowadays as scholars. This was something which was taught, right, way before us, but we're in a world where you can make any kind of a digital maps or virtual maps to display every kinds of things. For example, memories of people, and to learn how to address them in a certain way. So I think that those perspectives are quite good, at least from that point of view. When you see it, that you have the opportunity to access your inquiries and to present them in numerous ways. You have to. I think you have to experiment as well. So thanks.
Alberto, you have some reflection?
For me, in my teaching experience, I speak in particular for Italy, and I described the situation. The problem is the communication, the basic communication and the relationship between problems of didactic at all levels, kindergarten, university, and the desire, the passion of practical itself. In a seminar of Pasolini and Gramsci, I speak about Oliver Twist. In Italy, it's a high education for silence. In Italy, a level for the program, for the basic programs, is very rich. Classics, Latin, Greek, and also is a school of technical school. Dante Alighieri. All of school, but the students today, in front of the page Proemio, my difficulty is the relationship the passion didactical relation. E communication and desire anche. For me, the student, sorry for my English, hanno subito, come si dice, the problem of students is all the surface. Nothing leave the track. Their universe is a switch, a type of TikTok. And they think that the world, the external world is the same. And then death, illness, they do not have a switch. It's the same TikTok. Remains. And without Dickens and without Dante, for me, is this. Sorry for my English.
Okay, thank you. I don't think we don't have time. Is there any more question? Maybe one, but we must leave until 19:15. So we have 10 more minutes. I'm not saying we need to jump or run, but the doorman will kick us out at that time. So, okay, thank you one more time, and hope to see you tomorrow.